All right. Hello, everyone. As folks are coming in, if you can drop in the chat where you're streaming us from, that'd be awesome. We're going to go ahead and get started in a couple minutes. But for now, drop in the chat. Where are you streaming us from? Where are you visiting us from? So it seems like we have a couple folks from Michigan, a couple folks from Texas, Maryland, Los Angeles, one of our panelists. That's a little biased. We're from Wisconsin, Santa Cruz, California, nice. Portland, Oregon, Austin, Texas, Highland Parque, really, Marcos, Albany, New York, Wisconsin again, Fresno from Pedro, Victor from New York, Arizona. So it seems like quite a big diversity of states already. Oakland, California, nice. So a couple California folks in here, very good. Have Kentucky, very good. Any other? Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, nice. So we have Orange County as well, Colorado Springs. So very good representation of states. Thank you all for joining us today for our Mapping Migraciones Human Right to Nature webinar. This is actually the 4th webinar in this series, and I'm really, really excited to be here. So before I get started, I want to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Tania Romero. I am the host for this evening. I am the program coordinator at the Audubon Center at Debs Park here in Los Angeles, California. Now, I want to go ahead and thank you for joining us this evening for this event. We definitely have some exciting things planned for this evening, including the Q&A with Jose Gonzalez, which is the founder of Latino Outdoors, and Pedro Hernandez, which is actually my colleague, the Outreach and Engagement Manager at Audubon, California. Now, we're going to go ahead and host a Q&A portion at the end of this event. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat at any time, and we will answer them during that portion. Now, before we go ahead and delve deeper into the event, I want to go ahead and provide an update on our Mapping Migraciones project. Now, for folks that have never heard of our project and are not aware of it, Mapping Migraciones is actually a year-long collaboration with Latino Outdoors and Audubon. And the idea behind this project is to be able to celebrate Latinidad, migration, and stories. So we're actually collecting migration stories from the Americas, from the general public like you, and we're showcasing how people and birds are connected to each other through geography and culture. So every month and a half, we update the map with new stories and new birds. So I will now transition to Marcos Trinidad. He's actually the lead for our stories committee, and he will give us the updates of what we added this month to our map. So Marcos, take it away.
Hey everyone, I'm happy to be here and share this project. We're going to highlight a few, or what we're doing is each webinar, we're adding a couple more stories and countries and birds to highlight. And really how that works is we're asking folks to submit their migration stories. It works out where as they're able to, or people are able to submit their migration stories, what we do is we overlap them with similar migration patterns through birds, and then we're able to put that on a map where you can check them out. And if you can put the map up, we can share a little bit of what that looks like. And this is really how we want to be able to highlight that. We understand as birders, as folks that love conservation, we look at a migrant bird coming through and the beautiful colors and everything, and just understand how they're able to really get from point A to point B and that journey. And what is so beautiful about this project is we're able to highlight people's stories, because people been migrating on some of these same patterns. So this is our landing page. You can come out, you can read a little bit about the story. You could see just some of these patterns that folks are making. And if you go to the map, you click down here on check out the map, it'll take you to our stories map. And as that loads, what you're able to see is a little bit about the individual that has shared their story, as well as birds. So over on the left-hand side, you can see some of these birds that are being highlighted. So for this round, our news stories are coming from Argentina, Belize, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Guyana. So if you click on one, you're able to go to that that story, and as well be able to see which bird makes that. Here we have the swallow-tailed kite, but also you click down at the bottom on the story and it'll take you to the person's story. So this is a super fun project. It's great to really read these stories and make these connections. One thing we would love is if you can share this project and submit some stories. We'd love to hear and see what you have to share.
All right, thanks Marcos for that update. So like I mentioned, it's super exciting project. I have had such a pleasure being able to work on this project. So for folks, if you have a story to share, we highly encourage you to go ahead and check us out on our landing page and take the survey. We will love to hear from you. We will now get started with our event on the human right to nature, which will go over the AB 30 by 30 bill and its importance, how to get involved, and the importance of advocating for the human right to nature. And I would like to go ahead and introduce you to my colleague, Pedro Hernandez from Audubon, California.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya, and thanks everyone for joining us as well too. Let me just make sure I start my timer. Ready, go. But yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. Like I mentioned earlier, my name is Pedro Hernandez. I work with Audubon, California as our Outreach and Engagement Program Manager. So I'm our state policy advocate on climate issues on multiple different levels, locally, statewide, and federally as well too. So Stefania, if you could pull up the presentation, I'll be talking a little bit about AB 3030, which is our state effort to pass the human right to nature. We have a very ambitious goal of becoming the first state in the country to formally acknowledge the human right to nature. But I will be spending actually most of my time talking about some of my family's migration stories and some of my own stories as well too, and how that relates to the San Joaquin Valley, which is an area in Central California where my parents migrated to as well. So yeah, I hope to illustrate this story. I'll use some personal stories and some big data, but I hope you know, this can be an example of one of the ways we're trying to elevate the different stories of Latinidad and how this all integrates with migration and nature. So yeah, just to kick things off, you'll see a lot of pictures of me tonight, but this is actually a picture of me and my father somewhere in the mountains. I don't know exactly where, but I thought this was a great example too, because early on in my own history, you know, access to areas was something that my family believed very strongly in, despite the area that we grew up in. So yeah, Stephanie, if you could go to the next slide. So just to start things off with grounding us in what the human right to nature is. And this is actually a picture right across the street where I grew up in. So you'll be seeing a lot of pictures I took today, actually, too. I wanted to be super current. But the human right to nature is something that we strongly believe at Audubon. You know, we are a birding organization and we protect birds, not only for their own inherent worth, but also because they're an indicator species to the types of environment that people grew up in and live in currently. But more broadly as well, too, we want to make sure that we're protecting nature beyond birding as well. And so what this human right to nature does is would declare California state policy that outdoor access is a human right. We know from many recent reports, but also, personal stories, that communities of color are 3 to 4 times more likely to live in nature-deprived areas, whether this is original habitat that has been converted to urban uses, or other types of land uses as well. We know that communities of color benefit less from nature. And we can see this in public health data. We can see this in community property values. We can see the lack of green or the presence of green in communities. So there's multiple different ways that we can measure this. But it also expands beyond recreation to include the benefits of nature, because we believe that the human right is also the human right to clean air, clean water, to the mental health benefits that nature provides. So we want to make sure that we're being very intentional in shaping state policy to move beyond just recreation, which again is very important, but we want to make sure that folks are benefiting from all the benefits of nature. And as far as where rubber hits the road, our bill would actually direct all state agencies in California to advance and fund the human right to nature as well too. So we understand that from the state policy perspective, this is something that a lot of different agencies need to be incorporating at the forefront, and incorporating these issues of equity and environmental justice and biodiversity protections into their decision-making as well. Because I think given the history of California and history of the United States, the protection and forthright consideration of human rights hasn't been something that has always been respected, especially for indigenous communities, which many of the lands we currently occupy are situated, but also for many of the recreational areas as well that have been created. So we want to make sure that human rights are at the forefront of our engagement in nature discussions as well. So next slide, please, Estefania. And one of the reasons, again, too, why we want to make sure that people are benefiting from the human right to nature is just these two different this stark comparison of news articles. On the right-hand side, right, for the birding community, I'm sure a couple of you have heard about Wisdom the albatross, which is honestly one of my favorite birds. And I think Wisdom, who is one of the oldest or the oldest recorded bird in human history, right? 70 years old, still, having little baby albatrosses, right? And Wisdom is a remarkable success story of what happens when we take care of the environment. But on the other hand, on the left-hand side, we see an article from the Fresno Bee. This is the newspaper that serves my community of Fresno, that demonstrates pretty forcefully that communities of color have shorter life expectancies. So in South and Southwest Fresno, where there's very large populations of Latinx communities, of African-American communities, life expectancy is 20 to 30 years less than areas of North Fresno. And so even across town, across the city, we can see that the tangible effects of lack of maintenance of the environment, has nearly immediate impacts on public health and on our communities as well. So we know when we take care of the environment, we take care of everything else that depends on the environment. But again, this is only one of the many ways we can demonstrate that that communities of color are lacking access. So our Human Right to Nature bill is an effort to intentionally consider these historical incidences of discrimination and correct them in part with state policy and with state resources. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And so I wanted to just demonstrate with my own personal story. This is one of the many ways we can help demonstrate the human right to nature. But actually, this is the mobile home park that I grew up in. I took this picture today as well too. That cooler, that swamp cooler on top is probably 30 years old. But if we can keep going to the next slide, please. Yeah, and just to introduce myself, right? Like y'all saw that I grew up in a single wide mobile home, and so out we didn't have a lot of space. We had a family of 5 or 6 with visiting family members at times. And so that single wide trailer with, 2 bedrooms didn't have a lot of space for us. So I actually did spend a lot of time outside in the surrounding area, whether it's just in the nearby street or in our backyard as well. And these are just 2 of the pictures that I have as well. But even, I was always a fan of dogs and animals and nature as well too. And so actually, it was my love of dogs that led me to my my appreciation of most of the rest of nature, and including birds as well too. So I think this was really important in my overall formation, and just as far as my connection with the outdoors. But next slide, please. But how I ended up in the San Joaquin Valley and in California. This map is a little rudimentary, but I think demonstrates where my family is from in Mexico. The orange dot on the southern part of the map is Nayarit, which is a western coastal state in Mexico, where my father's family originated. And on the yellow dot is the border of Nuevo León and Texas, where my mother's family came. And they both migrated from these respective regions of Mexico to California to work in the fields as farm workers, because they heard that the farm workers in California were paid more. And so due to poverty issues, due to the story of the American dream, that was one of the reasons why my parents wanted to leave Mexico and make that hard decision to leave some of their family members behind in order to provide for a new family. So next slide, please. And so when we moved to the San Joaquin Valley, it's a ecologically significant migration corridor with many environmental injustices. And so on the left-hand side, we have the Pacific Flyway, which is the migratory path that birds have used for migration for thousands of years. And on the right-hand side, where this color-coded map is, you see Cal-Enviroscreen, which is a state mapping tool that gives scores to cumulative pollution burdens. And the more red and orange you are, the higher pollution burdens you find. And so what you can see here is that the San Joaquin Valley, where I live, has a lot of social vulnerability and environmental injustices, but is still an important area for birds. And so the overall degradation of the environment has led to the negative outcomes in health for birds and for people. Next slide, please. And we can see here that there's been a dramatic loss in our original habitat over the last 100 years. And again, this is a lot of fast data, but I want to just set this context that where I'm living at right now, and where the part of the reason why people live in nature-deprived areas is because the nature that existed has been lost. And so when we talk about protecting areas, this is some of the slivers that remain. Next slide, please. And so this is an overlap of a lot of data layers together. And so you have the Cal-Enviroscreen, but you have these darker protected areas. So these darker areas that are outlined in red, these are areas with high levels of protection. And so Audubon has been one of the first organizations to use these sets of data together. And what we can see here is that there's actually not very significant environmental protections in the San Joaquin Valley that again have lead to different life expectancies and also species at risk of extinction and being threatened. Next slide, please. And some of the ways this manifested here in the San Joaquin Valley, this is an image from last year during our record wildfire seasons, where the sun was orange and dark red due to the different pollutants in the air as well too. And so this is an area where when California was on fire last year, when we had our record-breaking wildfire season, a lot of the smoke also was found in the San Joaquin Valley. So this led to not only birds being forced from some of their nesting grounds, but also from us having some of the worst air quality in the world. Next slide, please. And, you know, as far as specifically how this has been impacted in the area that I grew up in, these are pictures from the surrounding areas. And so you have these larger ecosystem breakdowns, but you also have the built environment that leads to the pollution and the lack of access to environments. And so this is literally the north, south, east, and west of the mobile home park that I grew up in. On the left-hand side, you see a junkyard. On the top right, you see a highway with diesel trucks. On the bottom right, you see a big tractor kicking up dust. And on the left-hand side, you see a canal used for irrigation. This canal is actually one of the few areas that we did have to either walk. When I was a kid, we also tried swimming in the canal, and we got pulled out pretty rapidly because our parents would say, hey, there's pesticides, that water's not clean. And so even up in this area, just due to a lot of the intense agricultural practices, we're exposed to a lot of pollutants as well. You know, as I mentioned, pesticides, they would spray the nearby farmlands in our area and literally drop it right over our homes as well. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the loss of native habitat, whether it's been converted to industrial uses or agriculture, has led again to the lack of green spaces. That you can see here, there's a lot of brown and dry areas. And this is literally, I took these pictures today. And so this has literally led to the loss of nature in many farm worker communities. This is something that's not unique to the mobile home park that I grew up in. So Stephanie, if you can hit the next slide. And to show you an idea, now that I've kind of set this big context, this was called the middle. All the kids called this the middle. This was our green area that we had to play on. This is maybe 12 feet, 15 feet between the different trailers, and we would still try to make do with what we had, but this was a farm worker community as well too, so we had limited means, right? And you know, I could not afford to drive myself out to the mountains that were 2 or 3 miles away. So this is actually what our access to nature looked like on the day-to-day, where it was literally this strip of grass in the midst of a highway, in the midst of a junkyard, in the midst of agricultural fields as well too. And so this was one of the few safe areas that we actually had to recreate as children and as families as well. And if you can go to the next slide, Stephanie. I think that also led to, at least me personally, appreciating some of the periods of joy, right, that was able to find in nature. And so actually, due to the area that we grew up in, we did take some vacations, or some at least trips for the day out to you know, areas that I guess we would loosely describe now as maybe more pristine. You can see me here in the snow a lot. This is me losing to my sister on some like competition on the top left. On the bottom left is when we traveled to Mexico, to my father's home state of Nayarit. It's a coastal area, so we had a lot of connection to this coastal region. And also used the limited area that we had for barbecues and family get-togethers as well too. And so I think what I kind of want to leave this talk with as well, and I'm on my last minute or so, is just to highlight that while many of the Black and Brown and Indigenous communities live in areas that are, again, are polluted, are deprived of green areas, I think everyone still in these types of environments can thrive. In these types of environments can find joy, and in these types of environments can help reconnect our, you know, ourselves to nature as well, in ways that maybe have not, we haven't experienced recently. And so I think just more broadly too, just celebrating the joy that people find in the outdoors, whether it's again, birding or barbecuing or kind of doing whatever, biking, running. There's a lot of different ways that we can enjoy the nature that surrounds us. And again, I think by making sure we're building connections with these areas and protecting these areas as well, I think we can not only address the discrepancies of the lack of green space, but we can also meaningfully address the negative public health impacts that communities of color have faced as well too. So just as a good context setting, I hope that was at least informative. I could talk forever about this, but I'm gonna take a break and leave some space for Jose and the rest of my colleagues. So thank you for bearing with me.
Bueno, pues, Tania, or I'll go ahead and continue. And apologies as always, as if there's too much background noise on my end. Ironically enough, our neighbors are working on their urban greening project. So I don't mind it less since I actually get to hear birds right outside my window. I'm greeting you all. So first of all, saludos, buenas tardes, good evening, wherever you all might be attending right now. My name is Jose Gonzalez, he, him, his, although I'll respond to anything offered with joy and respect. I'm greeting you all from the ancestral, traditional, stolen and unceded lands of the Nisenan, Southern Maidu, Miwok, among others as well, in what is at the moment Sacramento, California, Sacrastan Califas. And I'm excited to be here with all of you because birding essentially, but really the world of birds is something new to me in terms of the identity and culture that is practiced, just like outdoor recreation. But of course, birds themselves are not new. And what's exciting for me is as I've engaged with really better understanding and appreciating the ways in which the birding community really values and connects to a wide range and variety and diversity of birds. For me, is what that has meant in continuing to reconnect to the work of cultura, of community, and my own story. And normally I have like a lot of slides as well to share. However, in this case, I think Pedro set a really nice context for it. And then two, I'm gonna share more of the story with me. And then of course, we can always refer back to the Q&A as well as some links that Audubon staff will be dropping in. So first and foremost, I'm also from Nayarit, so surprise. I'm an immigrant from Mexico. I was born in Amatlan de Cañas, Nayarit, the oldest of what is now 9 siblings, 9 of us total. My dad is from Nayarit and my mom was literally from across the border, like just within a 45-minute drive in Jalisco. And I came to the United States right before the age of 9 and settled also in the Central Valley of California. Quick stop in Tulare, so just close to Fresno before settling in Turlock. And that is where I did the rest of my growing up. So I had this combined, bifurcated, and ambicultural experience of growing up, much like Pedro is noticing, in Amatlan, the outdoors was just outside. It was a small, relatively rural town. So I think in the same way that maybe kids in the United States like grew up with a farm experience, that maybe they had a nearby forest that they were able to go to, or where nature was just outside. I recall a lot of that for me growing up, and that nature was part of just the outside experience, whether that meant walking to school, which was at the edge of town, so it was walking along the river to get there, whether it meant visiting one set of grandparents and it would be climbing up one hill to reach them, or whether it would be going with another set of grandparents as they tender their milpa, right, their crops. And so I didn't connect to nature with a sense of outdoor recreation. It wasn't a hike. It was literally to go get to from point A to point B. We weren't birding, but we were noticing and watching the different types of pájaros and the garzas. Later on, I'd be like, oh, wait, there's a difference between an egret and a heron and a crane and all these things. And at the town, they were all garzas. And so all of these little elements. And coming to the United States provided my first experience at being able to now engage with and wrestle with nature, just as Pedro is mentioning, in both the ways in which we also had a medio strip in growing up in an apartment. So they weren't mobile homes, but they were apartments. And in many ways, it's the same difference, because the only difference really was what they were constructed out of. But the sense of community, the struggles, the economic stresses and disparities were pretty much the same. And then actually traveling to the outdoors provided me this range of experiences that were a little different. Now we actually had to drive somewhere to experience some form of outdoor recreation. And those first experiences was going to a local river park. And part of that experience was knowing that I never actually learned the name of that park until much, much later, like in college, because we would name things according to what was there. So this was El Parque de los Gallos, the Park of the Roosters. Later on, I realized, oh, it's named after some county supervisor or something for Merced. But it was because there were roosters there. And then later on, other types of peacocks and peahens as well. So that was an example of how I began to notice how much nature in terms of the naming was also, it's at least in terms of Spanish, let alone, of course, the indigenous history, was present in a lot of California that I began to notice. So places like Oakland had Encinales as a name prior to that, which is a type of oak, I believe a tan oak. Places like Palo Alto, which is the tall tree named for the redwoods. Even a place like Paso Robles, right, the path of the oaks. So these were little elements that I would years later use in terms of connecting communities to outdoor experiences. And then in 6th grade, I had my first kind of transformative outdoor experience by visiting Calaveras Big Trees State Parks, seeing sequoias for the first time. And that was also an engagement with understanding this sense of a protected landscape. So as Pedro was showing the map of like those dark green spots, noticing like, oh, those exist in these particular ways in the Central Valley, in California, but in the Central Valley. Years later, I realized that where my uncles would take me fishing was actually at a national wildlife refuge. I never knew that until years later. And then after that is acknowledge being able to become aware of saying, here are all the ways that we care about the quote unquote natural or the ecological community. As I began my path in kind of nature oriented and conservation work, I would see all of these amazing migration maps, detailed. There was so much information. And I would ask, what are these for? And it would range everything from monarchs to cougars, like mountain lions, and of course, birds. And that fascinated me. I said, how much we know and how important it is to protect landscapes in which these members of the ecological community, such as birds, need this for migration. And then when I began to ask the question, do we have the same for people? There was little to nothing. I found like one map that actually attempted to really track the movement of migrant farm workers. And that was reflective of my community. That was part of what my mom did. That was part of what my dad did. And that was part of what many of the families that I would work years later on as a teacher, that they did. And I felt this sense of frustration, of irony, of curiosity as well, to say, how is it that we can, in the conservation community, care so much about the migration of wildlife and struggle with, misunderstand, or feel so disconnected with caring about the migration of people? And part of that is we value the interconnected web and sense of community and ecology. And I think some of us still reference John Muir, for example's quote about you pull on something and it's connected. We won't get into the John Muir conversation right now, though. And I thought, people migrate for these same reasons. My parents migrated not because they thought, vámonos al norte, let's go north to take someone's job. That was not the orientation. It was the effects and impacts of NAFTA, of economic trade agreements that began to say, let's prioritize the mobility of consumer goods, but not of people. And so I wanted people to understand, if we paid attention to that, it mattered in terms of how these were connected, of when we began to talk about systemic issues. Just in the same ways that we say, it's not the bird's individual choice to want to say, hey, I want to go here compared to there. Oh, but I'm realizing that there's an actual border around this landscape, so I better be careful. And so I wanted to really unpack that, especially as I began doing the work of quote unquote, engaging the Latinx community with nature and the outdoors. And that was the founding of Latino Outdoors, and what began this wealth of experiences of unpacking all of that. And so I'll close by sharing a few more things. You are, and Marcos is correct, neither John Muir nor Audubon on this one for this moment. As you've been seeing some of the links that Estefania has been dropping in the chat, I provide some of these experiences. Encontrando mi parque is about being able to say, this is how I found my park. This is what, combining these elements of like my Mexican nationality and heritage with a Latinx identity and also a Chicano identity in the United States, what this meant, that it was a both and. How could I care for, quote unquote, my community and communities of all backgrounds that face systemic injustices, along with these outdoor experiences and the community found in those, right? Our non-human kin. And birds became such a powerful element of that because we could resonate with that because they also migrated, and it became a point in starting for conversation. I took a group of families as one of those Latino Outdoors experiences to part of the, in Palo Alto wetlands, which again is part of the protected landscapes of the flyway. And we began the conversation by asking the family, like, what do you notice? What do you recognize? And not less so about like, let me teach you about all the birds that I know and that I want you to know. And this one dad spotted, what ideally is one of the easiest things to notice, a turkey vulture. And so you can kind of say, well, it's a turkey vulture. It's like kind of spotting a pigeon. But I'm like, but that's amazing, right? Because then that becomes a starting point. And we all know all birds are amazing in that way. And I asked them, what does that remind you of? Or do you know a name? And he ended up giving 5 names for it in Spanish. And I thought, that's amazing. I only have 1 in English. Let's combine them and I will have 6, but you got me beat by at least another 4. What can you tell me about those? And he connected this to a story about his own father. And he said, my dad would tell me that this is the story his grandfather would share about how in the Mexican Revolution, these are the birds you would look for, because they would tell you in terms of if a town was supported through law enforcement, or if the townspeople had to resort to their own, law enforcement and string up the bandits. And I'm like, I'm just sitting here thinking, I just asked about the birds, but I get this beautiful, rich history. And those can become connective experiences for how they'll come back, rather than me for treating my community as kind of objects of programming, right? That I am here to impart that rather than to co-create an experience. So that's part of what has been important to me. And so as I'm getting near to my end, what has mattered a lot about this is that role of policy. And so a lot of our outdoor experiences, it was important to stress at least 4 Ps. How are we connecting people to people and to themselves? So to other people and themselves. What does it mean for them to come out here and feel a sense of connection and community? Because so often they don't feel that. What they feel is a sense of disconnection, of othering, maybe even of criminalizing, that they're there up to no good. They're there to get in trouble. They don't belong there. They get a lot of those cues and signals. The second is people to place. What does it mean for them to leave with an experience of knowing more about this place, its history, the ecological community, what its purpose and role is? Because while yes, some Latino families may like a soccer field, it's important to not just think, oh, they're only gonna care if there's a grill and a soccer field. And that was important for conservation organizations to understand. Start with the invitation. And the community and the families understood why some were preserves compared to why some were county parks, compared to why some were reserves, and that was important. The other P is people to process, and that was important to say, what does it take to come out here and be well and safe and enjoy the experience? There are basic things like risk management, how to make sure you don't get lost, that you're hydrated, all of those elements, having supportive shoes, without being prescriptive about saying, these are the kind of branded gear you should have. And then lastly, people to policy. The fact that this place is here because of people decisions, people choices, and we could all have a voice for that. So the important thing was about engaging our community in these policy elements because they matter and they have an effect on what we do. And so I'll close by saying, gracias, we'll talk a little bit more, but that orients kind of my whole experience in relation to why I do this, and it's how it's all connected for me.
Yeah, thank you both so much for sharing your story and being able to really be able to tackle a well-rounded approach of this human right to nature, right? Like, because as Pedro started, like his story is very focused on just the physical aspect space of like certain communities, right, do not in general have access, right, or enough green space in certain areas, right, due to habitat loss, urbanization, etc., environmental justice, racism, etc., right? And Jose, I love how you turn that of like, well, even if these places are created, right, there is still a barrier of welcoming and culture that needs to be changed and shifted. And that's also included into that human right of like, people need to feel welcome, and there cannot be an isolated or single tunneled vision of this is what recreated in nature is. So really appreciate that, because to be quite honest, that's also not something that the AB 30 by 30 bill even touches on, right? Like, we're just in the simple fight of let's create more green space, right? And I think adding on to like my own story, I grew up in South Central LA, so I get the whole Parque de los Patos, you know, like that's what we had, like the Park of the Ducks. And if you ask multiple Latinx households what a Parque de los Patos is, you know, they're talking about a different park. They're not all talking about the same park, you know? And aside from that, even in these spaces, it's like, for me, it was always like, well, how do I feel in these spaces? And half of the time, you know, I was driving from South Central LA to Pasadena, and the demographics completely shifted, and it was a whole other realm to navigate. So really appreciate your stories. And unfortunately, you know, they're not isolated incidents. I think they tend to be a real portrayal of a lot of what our communities are, right? With that said, I want to go ahead and open it for Q&A from the general public. I do have a couple questions to also touch on, but if you have any questions you would like to ask Pedro or Jose, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will allocate a couple minutes to be able to answer them. With that said, I'll get us started with the first question. Either one of you can tackle it. Give me a quick second. Can we talk a little bit about, to what degree has your connection to nature changed over time, or has it even changed?
Happy if you want to go first, Pedro. Huh? All right, I'll jump in real quickly, and I'll put it in this way. It has changed in the sense that it's expanded, right? I spoke about the experience I had in Mexico, and then those initial experiences that I had here in the United States, specifically California. The way that it expanded, and this is the critical component for me, it's because it expands and reconnects. So it's a way for not to think that I evolved in a sense of like what I left behind, but rather how I continue to be connected to those roots. And it's expanded in the way that I've had opportunities to both really be privileged with some of these awe-inspiring and majestic engagements of nature in terms of faraway wilderness. I've had the opportunity to visit national parks like Grand Teton, for example. And this is especially knowing that I didn't even get to visit Yosemite until I was in college, even though I lived 2 years away, which is a common story of the Central Valley, right? We have one of these iconic majestic national parks that international travelers come from all over the world to visit it, and here we are two hours away. I've gone to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so for me, the expansion is to say, how do we ensure that these types of connections and experiences are there for our community, even if they're never going to visit? but we're supporting the fact that they do care about these places being protected and preserved. And then all the way zooming down to nearby nature, so that we ensure it's not an either or. And so the value of pocket parks and urban greening spaces are part of this connective tissue. And that we don't relegate to one or the other. So these outdoor experiences are not this kind of pyramid of saying the best outdoor experiences are up at the top and these multi-day backpacking experiences, and then at your city park is bad. It's like, no, there's so much wildness in nearby nature, but I really expanded my view of sometimes being able to sit down with crows and with squirrels and even with like the micro adventures down in a garden that have really like just been enriching.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in really quickly, I guess I'll say one of the ways my relationship to nature has changed. Well, some ways stayed the same. I mean, I have more dogs now, but just more broadly, I feel like I've been able to like deepen my connection with the land, and it's anything from knowing like what this plant name is to what it does for birds and how it also like supports like people's like community and sense of community, you know, and so just like I feel like I'm more maybe I don't want to say like home, but I feel I'm more grounded in like the spaces that like I occupy as well too. Even just learning, you know, bird behavior, right? I'm able to, you know, I know if I want to try to find this certain bird, I más o menos know like where to go and where I need to do too. And I feel like I'm navigating like this environment with less blinders on. And I feel that's just opened up so many just different interesting thoughts and like connections and just like personal explorations that I've been able to, you know, delve deeper in as well too. So I without that kind of deeper connection, I don't personally feel I would have been successful as an advocate or even at Audubon. So I am very grateful because it's been one of the ways I've been able to, you know, serve my community and also like make a living where I can help my family too. And that's been something I think a lot of us on this call are interested in.
Yeah, thank you all both for that. You know, and I like the whole like not forgetting, but it has expanded, right? And because I know I relate a lot to that as well. I do have another question of like, can we talk a little bit more about the connection you see between migration of people and the migration of birds? So what are the connections there?
It's a good question. There's, I think in the conservation community at large, and obviously in the birding community, we care a lot about the migration of birds. It's important, it's essential to their survival. I mean, all birds migrate in different ways, and some don't migrate as far as others. But we understand that especially those that make those long treks, it is part of the way that they live, and not just survive, but thrive. And so with human migration, specifically as an example with migrant farm workers, there has always existed some form of migration as an example between Mexico and the United States, and how the border was open and allowed for this ebb and flow. The irony is that with the militarization of the border, it actually pushed a lot of the migrant workforce to say we should stay in the US because now we can't move in the same way in terms of let's come and work the fields and then return back to Mexico. And so ironically, it's disrupted a migration pattern that had existed and even at some point, you know, was supported by the US and encouraged. And so for me, I can have the quote unquote partisanship politicization discussion about it separately. I want to understand this elemental component about what does it mean to have healthy communities and thriving communities, understanding how migration is supported, especially in ways that are not just niceties of privileges. I'm not talking about migration in the sense of like, well, I can just move anywhere else and like buy a house. No, it'd be understanding that the systems that we benefit from, such as where our food comes from, has relied on a movement of people in a community that has been doing this work. And disrupting that, disconnecting ourselves from it, or benefiting from it without really thinking about that, to me is as concerning as being able to just expect birds to exist and not care about in terms of how they move from these places.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Jose. We're pretty much at the end of our Q&A, but there's one last question that I think is super important on here is what advice do you have for parents, teachers, or anyone that works with youth to build that stronger connection with nature before adulthood?
Be super quick so that Pedro can get a word in. All parents are teachers, right? And what's important around that is to say, don't overly stress about like knowing it all and how to do it. Supporting inquiry, supporting questions. Kids are natural scientists and investigators in terms of trying to assess and make sense of the world. And sometimes rather than getting stuck about feeling you have the right answer is supporting the questions. So you may not quote unquote know the name of a bird, and that's okay, because sometimes maybe that name needs to change. But that bird has existed long before it had specific names in that way. So you can just ask in terms of paying attention to observation. And so here are 3 simple questions that are tested by a solid curriculum out of the Lawrence Hall of Science at UC Berkeley, for example. You can look for the observation. What do you notice? What do you observe? What do you see? Second, what does it remind you of? Right? Is it familiar in some ways? What does it make you think of? And then I wonder, what does it make you wonder about? To think about, like, why does it do that? I wonder how it is that it flies like that, regardless of size, and all of these different elements. So that is one way that I recommend to at least start to approach.
Yeah, and I guess one way, I mean, it always helps to have an extra pair of binoculars, but I mean, there's a lot of different ways to like learn about nature, whether it's like in movies or like anime or like in literature or like or just like stories as well too. So I guess I want to make sure we're like have like a palette of all the colors we can paint with, instead of just thinking about like getting out to places. It is important. We do have to encourage that, but I do think like being imaginative and building our own like organic and unique connections with nature too is, you know, I have a bunch of houseplants. Like I love them. I think there's a lot of different things doing native plants in your yard so you can attract more wildlife and pollinators and birds and stuff too. So I really want to help shift the narrative from just spending money and being outside to like there's other ways we can reinforce. And I think, you know, in addition to those things is that how we keep the connection over the long term.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think it's a lot about like being able to find the nature that's already there for you and really, you know, thinking outside the box to connect with that, you know. Thank you both so much. I'm gonna go ahead and end our Q&A, and this naturally transitions us to what we've been getting a lot really also in our questions here is like, what can we do to help? How can we personally help to advance this bill? And with that, we're gonna go ahead and transition to Pedro because he's gonna give us a couple of action items.
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I work with Audubon California's policy team, and so I'm Stephanie. If you could bring up the slide, just wanted to close out with a couple of different items and our state virtual advocacy day. I mean, ultimately, as proposing policy, I mean, I will just say, first of all, that policy has been used to discriminate and to restrict access to nature. And so I think policy can also be something that unlocks access for and the benefits of nature to a lot of us. And so we want to invite folks to our California Virtual Advocacy Day. It's on June 10th. So this is a little bit specific to California folks. But we definitely want to make sure that we're like connecting you to our advocacy efforts. We're going to be setting up Zoom meetings with different assembly members and different senators on bills beyond AB 3030, but everything that we're going to be doing is supporting biodiversity, supporting equity in public health, and supporting outdoor access as well too. So we want to make sure that we're advancing the different pieces of legislation and priorities, especially as our state and as the country is experiencing this climate crisis. California is entering another drought, on top of a lot of different issues we're still experiencing with COVID and so many other things. And so we want to make sure that Audubon California is elevating frontline communities and again residents within the network and everyone who is interested in protecting nature, because we want to make sure we're building an inclusive movement and making sure that Audubon can be somewhere where people find a sense of belonging in as well. So if you're interested in advocating, if you're interested in learning a little more or just plugging into the network, we want to make sure that y'all are connected. And you can find this link, I believe, either in the chat or on our Audubon California webpage. And for folks who are interested in advocacy but not in California, first of all, move to California. Just kidding. But you can support organizations like Latino Outdoors. There's a lot of different chapters in throughout the country, but also plug into your regional or state Audubon office as well too, to make sure that the human right to nature is something that is beyond California, because we want to make sure again that California can advance this, but this human right belongs to all of us. And so I think we all need to help do our part and plug into the networks to make sure, we're spending at least an hour or two in the next couple of weeks or so, making a difference and elevating these issues too. Because as I think we all kind of know, especially with COVID, maybe a lot of us are wanting more outdoor space or appreciating the benefits that brings. And so we want to make sure again that we protect the environment for the birds, for the plants, and for the communities of our future as well. So I'll drop my email on the chat in case people want it. It's pedro.hernandez@audubon.org. I'll drop it again in the chat, but feel free to reach out because we want to make sure we're connecting y'all to the services and advocacy that y'all need. So thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks so much, Pedro. So reiterating what Pedro mentioned, if you would like to join us for California Advocacy Day, the link is also set in the chat. Feel free to register there. And with that said, we have reached now our ending of this webinar, The Human Right to Nature. I want to go ahead and give another thanks to all of you for being able to attend and really being able to share this space with us in learning a little bit about our stories and some of the things that are important to specifically our community. Any last words from you guys?
After you, Pedro.
Well, first of all, happy with all the Nayarit love here in the chat. But thank you, everyone. I mean, we're only two stories of a larger narrative, but hope this can be demonstrative of the different needs that our communities have. So thank you again, and thanks for showing your interest.
And two quick things. Number one, encourage you all to reach out to Audubon in this project. So if you have a story that fits the project, submit your story so that you are there, con the little pajaritos, being like igual, just like that. And then second, that reminder that I said policy is people choices. So we all might engage in those separately, but it's a reminder that how some places existed, it is because of choices that people made before you. So what choices are we making? So 10, 50, 100 years from now, those are in those places are able to benefit from that or think about how those places exist based on the choices we're making now.
Okay, and with that said, that will conclude it, everyone. Thank you so much for chiming in and hope everyone's having a great Thursday. Bye, everyone.